I don't tend to review movies that have come out recently on the channel in general. On certain occasions, though, I do, if they really stood out to me or just an interesting change from the expected norm of the bigger blockbuster films. On this occasion, to me, this is one of those films. The film is a 2016 release, of course. It's just come out very recently, and it's called Morgan. It's a sci-fi thriller directed by Luke Scott. It's his first movie, and it's got a pretty decent cast, to say the least. You've got Kate Mara, Toby Jones, Michelle Yeoh, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Paul Giamatti, and various others. It's got a good cast, a really good cast. And the film gave off an aura to me of a very distinct attitude. It wasn't the kind of science fiction movie that is all awe and wonder. It's just not that kind of movie. It feels very grounded. It feels very much like the kind of movie that could be real in the not too distant future. It's got that very realistic vibe to it in terms of the way people look in the film, the way they speak, the way they act, and the way that the technology used, although yes, more advanced than what we have now, is integrated into their lives. It feels very grounded in that way. And again, without spoiling anything, the plot of the film, the very rough overview, is that the primary character in the movie, played by Kate Mara, is sent into this development centre, if you will, that looks very much just like an old house, to assess the level of development on a new piece of kit, essentially. And this piece of kit is the character called Morgan. She's sent there by the company who she works for to assess whether or not this Morgan is a viable product for their company, or if there are still bugs that need to be worked out. And as such, the film has a very serious tone. It's approached in a very, I would say, kind of an accountant kind of way. She's not there to be all starry-eyed in wonder of this technology. She's there to do a job. She's there to assess the situation, and that's it. And I liked that vibe that this film gave off. Now, for me, this wasn't a perfect film. Very few films are. But I did like what they started to do with the film, and I also liked the end of the film. It was a relatively short portion towards the third part of the movie, which I didn't like so much. And it wasn't that I didn't like what happened in the movie, it just felt to me that the pace of the movie suddenly kicked up a gear and went far too fast. It was like they burned through a load of story really quickly. The film outpaced itself, for me at least. This could have easily had another half hour added on just to improve the pacing. Now, the start of the film, over halfway even, as I said, I really liked it. It had a slow burn kind of feel, not necessarily tense, but just getting to know the people involved, and kind of like a character study of each one of them, Morgan included. And I liked that. It was a very alternative approach to the sci-fi thriller. But then, as the film progresses, it kind of devolves into a much simpler story, which wasn't bad. I definitely wouldn't call this a bad movie, but as I said, it just seemed to become very rushed very quickly. And for me at least, that was just kind of a shame. Overall though, I did like this movie. So now of course let's get into my individual 5 categories to break down the overall score that I'm going to give this film. First of all, we have the story and the plot. And for this film, Morgan, I'm going to give the story and plot a 7. And the reason why I'm going to give it a 7 is because although in parts it did feel rushed, overall I liked the story. It was relatively simple, but did well with what it had to work with. And I liked the fact that the film approached some more in-depth questions, rather than just the surface dangers of such radical new technology. It did go deeper. It went more into the emotional and psyche side of things rather than just the physical strength, speed, militarization, etc. that you'd usually have in a movie like this. So overall, I liked what they did with the story, so I'm going to give it a 7. As far as the characters and their motivations, I'm going to give the film a 7 again. And I really liked this aspect of the film. I like the people who were chosen to act in the film. I liked the performances that they gave. They weren't over the top, but at the same time they didn't seem stale. They seemed like real people who, some of whom more than others, were very passionate about this project, understandably so. And it was interesting to see how each one of them dealt with the same situation from some radically different points of view. And I did like seeing that. So overall, I'm going to give it a 7. As far as the visuals and effects of the film, well, there weren't a huge amount of special effects used. There were some, and those that were used were pretty good, but there just weren't a huge amount of them overall. And as for the visuals in general, it didn't really feel like anything special. It was good enough for what it needed to do. So overall, I'm going to give it a 6. That's above the baseline of 5, but it isn't necessarily going to blow your mind in any particular way. As far as the audio and the soundtrack of the film, again, I'm going to give it a 6, and the reason why is because it just does the job. The music was good, the sound effects were there when needed, but like with the special effects, they didn't really stand out. They were good enough for what they needed to do, but I didn't find the music overly memorable or outstanding to me in the way that something like The Hateful Eight, for instance, was, but it did the job. It was as good as it needed to be. So overall, it's a 6 from me. And finally, for the most personalised of the 5 categories, the rewatchability and entertainment, which is of course very, very subjective to me personally. Overall, I'm going to give Morgan a 7, because it's definitely the kind of movie that I will watch again, but at the same time, I don't think it's a film for everyone. Obviously, if you are a fan of sci-fi and thrillers in general, you will be more inclined to enjoy it, but even then, due to the fact that the story does very abruptly take a turn, and also has some things which some people won't be too happy about at the end of the film. Incidentally, the ending of the film I found very predictable. I predicted it right from the outset of the movie, but I personally still found it enjoyable. I liked the ending, but some people definitely won't. So it's certainly not a movie for everyone, but personally, I enjoyed it and I will watch it again. So for me, it's a 7. And that means that overall, as a tabulated score put together of all of our 5 categories, I'm giving Morgan a 3.3 out of 5, which doesn't sound overly high, but that's not really bad, considering that I did have some issues with the film, but overall, I did enjoy it. So my verdict of Morgan is that if you haven't had the chance to check out this movie yet, I would recommend doing so, because it's an interesting alternative to somewhat obvious storylines, and although it's not the most original of ideas, other movies have certainly played with ideas like this before, I would say that it's still good enough to recommend checking out. So that's it overall for this particular review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.